Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this St. Patrick's Day. It's the 17th of March. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information at weather.gov/Alaska. ARH.NOAA.gov will take you to the same place. You can always call the weather info line at 800-472-0391. Find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. If you've been following along on Facebook, in the last 24 to 36 hours, we've had some pretty good discussions about blizzard warnings and when they were forecast and when they were not for the Anchorage area, as well as the eastern parts of the Kenai Peninsula and the Portage Valley region. So if you haven't checked that out, it might lend a little bit of understanding to what happened perhaps Sunday night if you're still wondering where that snow was for Anchorage that actually wasn't ever forecast. And some interesting discussions about space weather. If you haven't heard by now, we are in the midst of a fairly severe solar event. And with that, not only could we have some communications interruptions, but we all know in Alaska that if the sky is clear and we have a little bit of a burp or more than a burp from the sun this time, there might be some spectacular lights. So if it is dark and clear where you are tonight, definitely take a moment, step outside and look up. You might have a really good show, perhaps one of the best in a while. Here's a look at what's going on out in the west. In the Bering Sea right now, the Pribilof still under a blizzard warning. Looks like strong winds and occasional snow will continue there. Those winds up to 25 to about 40 miles per hour through the early evening hours. And after about 7, 8 o'clock or so, conditions should start to improve. Winds will diminish and the snow should start to subside somewhat. So conditions will improve later on this evening. Maybe you'll get a chance to look up and see the lights as well. We hope. But most areas across the interior will have that opportunity if the sky clears up a little bit. This was the forecast as of around 4 o'clock this afternoon. And if you're a familiar tracker of the aurora and you go to Space Weather Prediction Center, which is part of the National Weather Service, the bright orange section here is where the aurora is most likely occurring. And we were getting reports out of London and Norfolk. I had some nice pictures out there a few hours ago. And as it gets dark again, we'll be watching more of the areas coming into Alaska there. You can find this anytime by going to weather.gov. There should be a headline at the top there that'll lead you to the Space Weather Prediction Center and more information about the solar event that's happening right now. So check that out if you'd like to, again at weather.gov. Here's a look at what's going on across the Bering Sea as far as weather is concerned. You'll notice that offshore flow still moving from east to west and southwest, but this is all part of low pressure working itself northward. A lot of warm air spreading northward as well. That's having some interesting effects on the eastern end of Norton Sound. Several polynyas have formed there, and what was once shore-fast ice is now becoming a little bit of open water, small open water, but some areas there in eastern Norton Sound certainly seeing some openings there, and the shore-fast ice not as shore or fast as it once was. So if you're moving through the eastern Norton Sound, communities there on Norton Sound, and yeah, those places along the historic Iditarod Trail could be affected there, so no shortcuts allowed. Looks like some of that could be changing there thanks to the rapid warm-up coming in from the south and southeast. And because of that there, and not to mention some big changes just in the last week to 2 weeks, temperature-wise, significantly warmer weather still moving northward as well. So there could still be some snow falling around Nome and around the south coastline there of the Seward Peninsula and points northward into the interior. Look out to the west. You can see a lot of dry air working across the central and western sections of the Bering Sea. That's what you see here west of St. Paul. St. Paul right there on the fringe, looking at some of the snow that's working your way and northeasterly winds cutting through, creating the potential for blizzard conditions there. Low pressure working up the eastern Gulf, also spreading moisture northward. A lot of this, though, is really going to focus on coastal areas of the Gulf, and we're not expecting a lot of precipitation to make it over the Kenai Peninsula into the Matanuska or Susitna valleys there, or really into the Copper River Basin, save for a few areas looking at some snow showers. Most of this, again, will be confined to the north and eastern coast. We have been seeing rain try and work its way into the outer coastal areas of southeast. A lot of that just isn't powerful enough to generate a whole lot of precipitation that we've seen just yet. So it may still take another day or so before the next surge kind of provides that added moisture. But all of this is rotating under an upper level low pressure system in the jet stream. And so each one of these waves, we call them short waves in the forecast office, each one of these short waves rotating around the upper level low just kind of adds another layer of clouds or moisture, and then it dries up a little bit and another one follows in right behind it. So it's kind of an active pattern in the Gulf and a very warm pattern for the west, and a developing windier pattern for the north coast as another wave of low pressure moves through there. Across the interior, though, pretty dry conditions. Here's the visible satellite picture. We finally have enough sun, nearly 12 hours of daylight, at least in south central Alaska, to see the visible satellite picture and show that to you in the afternoon, which I absolutely love. If you've watched over the last 3 or 4 years, any chance I get, I will show you a visible satellite picture because it tells the story. Here's a look at the white and snow across south central. Unfortunately, that is snow-capped mountains, not snow where most of us live and play. Across the interior, pretty dry conditions there. You can see some of the snow across some of the higher terrain. And then more cloud cover out across the west. A lot of this bubbling up as well. Even had some lightning strikes across the eastern parts of Prince William Sound yesterday under some of those clouds that were moving through. One wave of drier air is working northward. This will quickly turn into more of a trough of low pressure, so not really a true cold front at this point. The warmer weather working up the west coast continues to just kind of wobble and wave around out across the west. So you're going to see this line move just a little bit from west to east over the next couple maps. That warmer air moving off the coast will create snow for the Pribilofs, while it's more likely to be rain across the eastern Aleutian chain. Periods of rain and snow may mix around Prince William Sound and out across Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula and across some of the higher terrain. Chances are any rain you see across southeast should be pretty light at this point tonight. Most of the interior will see a partly cloudy sky, maybe some increasing clouds as we head into the early morning hours tomorrow. The upper Yukon Valley and perhaps areas just north of the Yukon Valley will have a better chance at a mostly clear night tonight. South central, clouds will be increasing as we head into the early morning hours there. So hopefully things are looking good wherever you plan to chase the lights. For southeast, periods of rain there as the front continues to move itself northward just a little bit more. This adds another wave of warmer and wetter air. Periods of rainfall for Kodiak Island and southwest. Otherwise, scattered in light areas of snow, including Nome and around eastern Norton Sound and along this frontal boundary now, which has kind of wavered backwards west just a little bit. So this is almost a stationary boundary for all intents and purposes. Out across the central and eastern chain, a 978 millibar low driving that warmer air around the eastern chain. Most of that is still going to be rain around Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, just to the west, though, and not by a whole lot of distance. Adak and Atka will be playing with rain and snow showers. As we get into Thursday, you can see one front's kind of falling apart, another one's trying to take its place, and what a messy pattern this is. As this moves northward, it's falling apart, another wave of warmer air working in from the south, so it just kind of recycles on itself out across the Gulf. Periods of rain and snow showers around the coastal areas of north and western Gulf, across southwestern parts of Bristol Bay. Periods of rain showers a little bit more likely south of Dillingham. And then rain showers for the central and eastern Aleutians with some pockets of snow across the north. Most of that pretty light and passing. And it looks like things should be drying up a little bit more for Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula coastline as we head into Thursday. Temps today in the 40s and 50s for southeast. A fairly mild day there, especially around Ketchikan, Craig, and Klawock. Prince William Sound, well, Valdez a little bit cooler at 36 degrees for 3 o'clock. The Anchorage Airport, Ted Stevens made it up to 47, I believe, which tied the record high. It might have been a little bit warmer by the 4 o'clock hour. This is Susitna Valley back in the mid-40s there. 34 for Fairbanks, 32 around Eagle, 22 in Northway, 12 for Fort Yukon this afternoon. Temps below zero for the Arctic coast, especially Barrow eastward, and then heading down toward Point Lay. Pretty cold start there this morning. Looked like Point Lay saw morning temperatures around 20 below, I believe, so had a hard time warming up there. But just down the coast, Kivalina was looking at 3 below. Kotzebue 6 and 9 below out in Tin City. Meanwhile, Nome and Norton Sound back in the upper teens. Bethel was at 38, McGrath 27, Tanana showing 21. Southwest was looking at temps in the 30s, even upper 40s there. And then as you get down the coast a little bit more, started to cool off again, but around Pilot Point and Port Hayden temperatures there in the mid-40s there, not too bad. Sandpoint 43, upper 30s and lower 40s for many in the chain as well, down to 32 though on Chimney, a much cooler flow coming in from the north. That trend continues out in the west. Meanwhile, the west coast enjoying the warm-up, perhaps. Won't speak for everybody in your house. Out across the west, that warmer air just kind of holds out across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Nome kind of right there on the line, so almost warmer. 11 degrees there, but in Kotzebue Sound, certainly cooler weather there. Sub-zero temperatures continue up across the Chukchi and Beaufort seacoast, and probably hovering close to zero around Fairbanks tonight. South Central 20s and 30s, Kodiak Island 38, upper 30s and lower 40s for southeast, with high temperatures tomorrow back in the mid to upper 40s. A few places probably tapping 50 degrees. South Central near 40 degrees and 44 in Kodiak Island. Upper 30s and lower 40s for the interior. Things will continue to melt and quickly there with more and more sunshine coming in. Teens and 20s for the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range. Sub-zero for Barrow and points westward and the Chukchi Coast. Kotzebue Sound, single digits and teens above zero, so things are warming up for you. And 20s and 30s for highs around Norton Sound communities tomorrow. So again, expect some changes and much warmer weather, and for dogs and humans included. 30s and 40s for Bristol Bay, and it looks like King Salmon up to 45 for your Wednesday. Here's a look at flying weather now. IFR conditions will be hit and miss just about anywhere you go for the west and northern Gulf Coast. MVFR conditions for a large part of southeast. For the Yukon Valley, especially the lower and middle Yukon Valley, IFR conditions there and also across the central and eastern chain. Anaktuvuk Pass and Adigan Pass should see some improvements tomorrow, heading for MVFR conditions as we go through the day and leaning back over toward IFR conditions for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass for your Wednesday. Rainy Pass may see conditions worsen just a little bit. MVFR expected there, and for Windy Pass on your Wednesday afternoon. Isabel Pass expected to start at VFR conditions with visibility and ceilings dropping just a little bit during the day. Mentasta Pass probably holding at MVFR through most of the day. Tanita Pass will probably get there by the afternoon. And Porter's Pass looks like IFR conditions mainly on the eastern side for your Wednesday afternoon, thanks to all that slop blowing in off the Gulf. And Chilkoot and White Pass, we expect to see IFR conditions through at least the morning hours, maybe some lifting of that by the afternoon. The freezing levels show that warm air is kind of spreading out all across the Gulf thanks to that recycling weather system we have with the upper level low out to the west. Surface freezing lines also kind of hovering over southwestern Alaska and then drops out across the central chain there. So we'll continue to see this type of pattern with that upper level low again out across the west. Because of that, icing potential pretty much mirrors the same pattern there. We've got at least some isolated and moderate across southeast. We saw a few reports there today. Most everything else seemed to be pretty light and isolated in and of itself. Above 4,000 feet for most areas, a little bit higher actually up across the north slope there. Some of that also reaching occasional moderate. Here's a jet stream, and that's the upper level low I'm talking about. So with that, we get that very large scale upper level circulation that's taking these surface storms and just kind of letting them hover and drift right here across the Gulf of Alaska. Meanwhile, the ridge of high pressure coming up the west coast has also got a hold of Alaska, and that means that warm weather is here to stay until something budges it out of the way. Southerly flow for just about all areas at 9,000 feet. Winds are a little bit stronger out over the central Gulf at 40 knots or so. Light winds coming in across southeastern Alaska, about 5 to 10 knots there, a little bit stronger for the Dixon entrance. South and easterly flow for the Alaska Peninsula as well, about 25 to 35 knots there. And southerlies coming up over the Bering Strait around 10 knots. We have a little bit more of a northerly flow at 3,000 feet though, because we've got a ridge of high pressure that's working in from Siberia. With that, we still have winds trying to feed into that area across the Chukchi seacoast and the interior. They're pretty light, 5 to 15 knots. Southerlies coming into southeast around 35 to 40 knots, and then we're back into that colder northerly flow from about Adak and Atka and westward, 25 to 30 knots there. Turbulence potential, pretty hit and miss. Occasional moderate across coastal areas of southeast and maybe around Cook Inlet, generally below 5 to 6,000 feet. And below 4,000 feet all the way into Norton Sound, some light to isolated moderate chops should be expected in the vicinity of the frontal boundary and the low pressure system across the North Pacific south of the Aleutians. That's a look at your aviation forecast. Back in a minute with a look at your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm Jim Peranto. Today in the studio I have Tina Neal, who's a geologist at the Alaska Volcano Observatory, or AVO. And today Tina is going to familiarize us with the AVO and tell us why the AVO is so important to Alaska. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you, Jim.
First off, what is the AVO and who works there?
Okay. Well, the Alaska Volcano Observatory is a joint scientific program comprised of the U.S. Geological Survey, the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute, and the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. So it's a group effort, and our job is primarily to track the activity of active volcanoes in Alaska and, importantly, give warning when they are becoming restless or getting ready to erupt.
What are the primary objectives of the AVO, and how do you go about meeting those objectives?
The primary objectives are threefold. The first is to track these active volcanoes and monitor their state of activity so that we can issue alerts and warnings when they become restless and look like they're threatening to erupt. Secondly, we try to assess the likely future eruptive scenarios at these volcanoes and what sorts of hazards and effects could be associated with these eruptions. And then thirdly, we spend a lot of our time conducting basic scientific research into the processes of volcanism, and this is important to understanding better how our planet works and also to improve our ability to forecast eruptions.
And you have equipment that monitors these volcanoes across the state?
We do.
Okay.
The primary means for tracking activity at volcanoes worldwide is the use of seismometers, or basically earthquake sensing devices. And so we have more than 120 of these devices spread out across the volcanic arc of Alaska. On each active volcano, we have a network of about 5 or 6 of these seismometers that ring the volcano. And it's those sensors that are constantly listening to the volcano, basically, to pick up earthquake or other ground vibration activity that could mean the volcano is restless.
Okay. Now, why is the AVO so important to the pilots and other Alaskans up here? As you know, we have a huge aviation community up here in Alaska, so it's got to be particularly important to them.
You're absolutely right. One of the primary reasons for AVO being here and for growing through the years as we have is that there is such a huge aviation component to life and commerce in Alaska. And the Alaskan type of volcanoes tend to be explosive. That means their eruptions often produce towering columns of ash that can rise 30, 40, 50, 60,000 feet into the sky in a matter of minutes and produce these ash clouds that drift many hundreds or thousands of miles downwind. So those become a severe hazard to aviation of all kinds, low altitude traffic as well as the high altitude jet traffic. So one of our main jobs is to work to get information about these eruptions quickly into the aviation communication stream so that pilots and aircraft can avoid areas of danger.
Now, I don't know if this is correct or not, but about half the population in Alaska live near an active volcano. Is that right?
That's right. About half the state of Alaska's population is within 200 miles of an active volcano. Of course, that's here in south central Alaska and includes the valley and Anchorage and the Kenai Peninsula. We're just downwind directly of Mount Spur, Redoubt, Iliamna, Augustine, all the volcanoes close to us that have been historically active in one way or another and could produce eruptions that at least drop ash on the populated communities of South Central.
So it's important not only to pilots, but just people in general.
Sure. Even folks on the ground 100 miles away from a volcano need to be prepared and know what to do should there be ash coming out of the sky.
How many volcanoes do we have up here in Alaska?
I like to say we have 41 active volcanoes, and by active we mean volcanoes that have had either an eruption or some significant unrest, earthquake activity or a large steam cloud production in the last 200 years, 250 years or so. That's our definition of active volcanoes.
Okay.
If you expand the time frame to look back at the last 10,000 years or so, the number may jump to 80 or 90 separate volcanic centers. So different geologists count the volcanoes slightly differently, but I think it's suffice it to say that Alaska is a very volcanically active region on the planet.
And why do we have so many volcanoes up here?
Well, it's a result of a planetary process that we call subduction, and this is one of the tenets of plate tectonic theory that's developed in the last quarter century in geological sciences. And subduction is a process whereby the outer rigid portions of the Earth's surface, which are broken up into about a dozen major plates, subduction occurs when these plates come together and meet, and one is actually forced downward below another. So you have an overriding plate and an underriding plate.
Okay.
And in Alaska setting, it's the North Pacific or the Pacific Plate, which is diving beneath mainland Alaska and the North American plate. As that downgoing material, which you can envision in your mind's eye just like a conveyor belt descending into the Earth's interior, reaches a depth of about 100 kilometers or 60 miles, the temperature and physical changes occur such that melting of the material in that region occurs. And the molten material that results is called magma and is lighter, less dense than the rocks around it, and it tends to rise to the surface of the Earth. And where that material punctures the surface of the Earth, you have a volcano. So along this subduction boundary where the two plates are meeting in Alaska, which basically parallels the Aleutian Arc, that's why we have this line of volcanoes. That same process of subduction and the two great plates meeting is also why we have such an earthquake active region here, and why Alaska is so seismically busy.
And it's part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, right?
Exactly. It's the northern arc of the Pacific Ring of Fire.
So subduction's happening all across the Pacific?
Basically all around the Pacific Basin, exactly. It's responsible for the volcanoes of South America, Central America, Indonesia, Japan, and Kamchatka.
Okay. One more question. How does the AVO work with other government agencies?
It's a really important part of the warning process that the Alaska Volcano Observatory works closely with the National Weather Service, Federal Aviation Administration, and other agencies at the state and federal level to be able to distribute these warnings in a very timely and accurate fashion. So our job is to communicate immediately with FAA and Weather Service when we either see a volcano becoming restless or we are certain an eruption has occurred. And we try to give them as much data, hard facts about what's going on as possible, so they can translate that information into their formal notification stream of SIGMETs, NOTAMs, volcanic ash advisories, and other message formats that I'm sure the pilot community is very familiar with. So we work very closely with those groups, Anchorage Center and the Aviation Weather Unit and other people in town. We meet with them several times a year to make sure our communication lines are open. And in addition to that, the observatory puts out both an email and text fax message when we have a volcanic event of any kind. And this can go to the public and the media. It's also available on our webpage. So we try to get information out along a number of redundant pathways to make sure it's as disseminated as widely as possible.
Well, folks out there want to get more information about volcanoes. There's some useful websites out there. There's one that talks about volcano preparedness, another one about volcanic ash, I believe, and then there's one that is for the Anchorage Volcanic Ash Advisory Center, which is part of the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit. And that might be some useful information to people out there. Of course, they can always contact you, Tina. You work right here in Anchorage.
Absolutely. We have an office up on the APU campus in Gould Hall, and we're always delighted to receive visitors, especially folks from the aviation community, because pilots are really our eyes in the sky many times. And I've been here for 14 years, and on many occasions, in the old days especially, the first indication of an eruption actually came from a pilot who saw it from the air. So we really appreciate that relationship and welcome visits or calls at any time.
Well, that's great. Boy, a lot of great information today. Thank you for coming in.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us here on Alaska Weather Facts. Until next time.
Thanks, Jim. Here's a quick update of the sea ice edge. Remember, we were talking about some changes with the shorefast ice right here across eastern and northern parts of Norton Sound. So if you're traveling through that area by air or by land or maybe by dog and by sled, you want to keep an eye on that because conditions could be changing pretty quickly there thanks to the airflow and the warm weather that's been moving through that region. Any more updates? Always on weather.gov/Anchorage/ice.php, as well as the 5-day outlook there for ice conditions. Here's a look at southeast marine forecast. East and southeasterly winds moving up the coastline and through the inner waterways around 25 to 30 knots. Coastal waves running around 12 to 13 feet on the inside, 2 to as high as 10 feet, with that easterly flow cutting across Frederick Sound and Stevens Passage by Thursday. Winds and waves subside a little bit more. More of an offshore flow continues for the coastal areas, anywhere from 10 to about 9 feet the further south you go. Southeasterlies continue inside of Clarence Strait around 20 knots. For south central, north and easterly flow coming down Cook Inlet, 25 to 35 knots with the highest winds and seas generally west of the Barrens and across the western Gulf. 35-knot winds there, 13 to 14-foot seas on the outside, 6-foot seas on the inside of Prince William Sound with an easterly flow diminishing to 15 knots by Thursday on a northeasterly wind. Easterlies coming into Kodiak Island around 25 knots with a 10-foot sea, and northeasterlies continue down Cook Inlet west of the Barrens and into Shelikof Strait at 20 knots there with an 8-foot sea. Across the Alaska Peninsula, northeasterlies inside of Bristol Bay. We've opened up the water there, and your sea forecast now at 3 feet for Wednesday. Easterlies a little bit further down the Bering Sea coast at 25 knots. A south and easterly flow for the Pacific coastline, 15 to 20 knots there with a 9 to 11-foot sea. About 9-foot seas there for Thursday, and north and easterly wind at 20 to 25 knots, and wind still generally light from Bristol Bay southward toward Cold Bay and northward toward the Pribilofs, running around 2 to 4 feet. You'll see those pick up in just a minute. For east and northeasterly winds for the central and eastern chain, 30 to as high as 40 knots there south of Adak and Atka. The wind's diminishing from yesterday. North and easterly winds 20 to 35 knots in the west from Kiska to Attu, and you'll see those winds pick up a little bit more as we get into a northerly flow, 30 knots with a 10 to 11-foot sea, and north and easterly winds continue for the central and eastern chain. Looking at the west coast, north winds coming across St. Lawrence Island at 10 knots there. Those pick up quickly as you head southward towards St. Matthew and Nunivak Island, about 30 knots there. 7-foot seas out around St. Matthew, 9-foot seas for the Pribilofs. And again, we're watching for some freezing spray. Northeasterly winds there on 30 knots and 25 knots coming out of the Kuskokwim Bay region, again from a northeasterly direction. All areas on Thursday looking at northeasterly winds, 20 to about 35 knots, a little bit stronger in the north and western bearing, 20 knots off of the Kuskokwim Bay and around the Pribilofs, 6-foot seas expected there. Now, as we get into the north slope, look for the winds to change as we go through the next couple days. Light winds for Wednesday, northerlies coming into the Chukchi seacoast around 5 to 10 knots or so, and picking up a little bit there across the eastern Beaufort seacoast north of Kaktovik. By Thursday, kind of a bigger change there around the Chukchi seacoast, 20 to 25 knots with that northeasterly flow, following a disturbance that moves from west to east. With that, we get back into east and northeasterly winds for the central and eastern Beaufort seacoast, still kind of light, but again, the stronger winds picking up across the Chukchi seacoast on the order of 20 to 25 knots. Recapping tonight's weather, warm weather is setting in and continues to hover around the west coast for the rest of tonight, tomorrow, and really the rest of the week. This boundary will kind of wobble back and forth across the west coast, and that will focus areas of light snow all the way from Kotzebue Sound, the Seward Peninsula, and Nome, Norton Sound, the west coast, and into the Aleutians, where some of that could actually fall as rain around the eastern and central chain. For south central and most of the Gulf Coast and southeast, really the best chance of any precipitation will be around the coastal areas. The further inland you get, the drier it's going to be, and you may be dealing with some clouds. For tonight, for many, a good chance to watch the aurora will be seen across Alaska, but watch those sky conditions, of course. The best chance for a clear sky looks to be across the interior, as it always seems to be, so enjoy it wherever you are if you're able to do so. For Wednesday night, look for that warmer air to hover across the west coast. Again, snow showers in the west and the north. Periods of rain and snow showers working through south central, and an increasing risk for light rain across southeast. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.